OK, cool. Now, let's get started. So, first of all, Source Labs who? Yeah, well, actually, Source Labs, most of the time when I speak to people, we are mostly known for hot sauce. So if you want hot sauce, if you like spicy stuff, come by the booth, which is probably over here somewhere, to get your, some hot sauce, if you like it. But actually, a brief story of Source Labs and, where we come from, what we do, because people have been wondering. So first of all, Source Labs, when we talk about Source Labs, we have to start with Jason Huggins, who developed Selenium in 2004, quite a while ago, actually. At that time, he was working at ThoughtWorks and needed a tool for browser automation, basically. A couple years later, 4 years, as we can see, he founded with other people Source Labs in San Francisco. And there's also, where the name comes from. Why Source Labs, right? Not because we like hot sauce. Well, that is part of it, actually. But it was called SOS, like source, is how they abbreviated it. But that doesn't work quite well if you think about it, if you talk about SOS all the time. So they decided on source, which stands for Selenium Acceleration Using Cloud Environment. And this is basically what we have been all about. Now, a couple years later, in 2013, Source Labs decided to back Appium, Bootstrap Appium, and so on and so forth, with funding, yada yada. And that has been what we have been doing for 10 years around. Web browser stuff, mobile stuff, and so on. But nowadays, we do a lot more things than just browsers, mobiles. I will take a breath here and let you digest this humongous slide. And if you pay attention to your top left API tests, this is basically what I'm going to focus on in the next 10 minutes or so to talk about. But before that, let's talk about mobile app tests. Technically, also web browser tests, and how you can use that things for API tests. Yes, I know Source Labs is all over the slides. Don't worry about it. What I'm talking about is something you can apply without Source Labs anyway. So, introduction, more or less what I already did. We're going to talk about the mobile app test using Appium. And if you listen to the previous talk, you already know quite a lot of things about Selenium, Appium. So I don't have to do much about that part. We're going to talk about API tests, which includes other things. The question part you can forget, because there is no question. And again, you might wonder, who is the guy actually who is holding you back from lunch? So yeah, that's who I am. I work at Source Labs. I've been in the IT industry for, well, a decade now. Yeah. Been in different roles since then: engineer, consultancy, QA, and so on and so forth. And now I'm here talking to an audience that is larger than I thought it would be when I got volunteered for this. Nevertheless, what I do in my free time when I'm not, working for Source Labs or doing open source stuff is I play badminton, mountain bike, boulder, smart home, as we said, and paperless. So if you want to talk about any of these things, you can come by the booth. And we can talk about that part. Now, you might find yourself on this slide somewhere, I hope. If not, yeah, well, feel free to grab lunch. But no, jokes aside, if you are in any of a similar role or one of the roles mentioned here on the slide, I think this talk could be something valuable for you. Yeah. Now, because nowadays a lot of people, play around with numbers, show a number, and then ask the audience, like, hey, what does this number represent? I make it a bit easier for you. I added a percentage sign. So can anyone guess what 83% means? Anything? No. Would make sense, yes, but no.
Hungry.
How hungry you are? OK. So are you going to faint when it's 100%? Or are you going then to run to lunch? Okay, no, so basically, yeah, 5 years ago, there was something released by Akamai who said that at that time, so 5 years ago, the amount of web traffic or API is making up 83% of all the web traffic. And that makes sense if you think about it, because APIs are the backbone, the foundation of all modern applications. Web, games, whatever, all communicate to some degree with each other services, and so on, via APIs. And API stands for Application Programming Interface, for those who do not know. So it makes sense to think about it, how we can decouple specific API issues from our front end. Now, if we, for example, use Selenium or Appium to test our applications, web applications, mobile applications, even things like games, I mean, in the end, it's a front end. So let's simplify by saying, okay, front end is everything, you as a user would interact with. They use APIs to communicate with kind of services and so on and so forth. Could be anything, which we say, okay, which we say are backends. And if something happens here in the front end, you as a front end developer, engineer, might get a ticket saying, hey, this button doesn't work. Then you start to debug it and find out, hey, that's not my problem. It's actually the backend. It's something with the APIs. You now have spent time, wasted time, debugging something which is nothing you can do about. Your QA people who run tests against the front end might encounter issues, thinking it is a front end issue, and then they don't see that the issues come from the API. Having said that, again, you should decouple things, front-end tests, API tests, and back-end, of course, from each other and test things isolated, but also focused. Now, what is it that you're going to learn? Well, you learned a bit about source labs, where we come from. I might ask you later on what source, again, stands for, so you might get something for that. Then we're also going to talk about, in this case specifically, about network traffic capture. So we're capturing API requests and responses for the application under test. The other things I could talk about, I won't. And I could also show you other things in API testing, which I won't. So we're just going to focus on the stuff in red bold, which is mainly API test creation and monitoring. Now, before I do that, let's take a step back and review how a typical workflow looks like when you do Appium test, Selenium test. It doesn't really matter in this case. You have a test that interacts with your application under test, your front end. We are creating a half file which contains API requests and responses. We're going to import that into the API solution of choice. We are then using that imported half file to create tests and so on and so forth, and use the created tests to monitor our APIs. Then we review that part, and we do it all over again and again. Now, how does this look like? Well, I'm also going to be brave and do a live demo about it. Okay, I'm lucky. So this is Source Labs. I have a couple of demo apps here, so let's use React Native. We are going to use a phone. Let's take an iPhone 14. And we are now installing that application, that demo application. By the way, written by a good friend of mine, Wim, who is not here today, unfortunately. We're going to install that app on a real device in the Source Labs cloud. Could be also your private device, it doesn't really matter here. Now, after the app is installed on the device, we are going to do some API calls within the application to simulate basically the workflow, right? What you're going to do. There we go. There is the app. So we are opening the menu here on the side, clicking on API calls. So, and then we have a couple of these buttons, which should, yep, there we go. Just clicking around, so some stuff is returned. We end the session, because that's all we needed. Going to watch the result quickly. There we go. Can I make this? Oh, yeah, okay, cool. Now, network, open it up. The joy of a live demo. Now, we have a couple of API calls we did. We see here some init calls. We see some stuff being returned. So let me zoom in for you. So you see, it's pretty simple. It's a GET request. We have a response, yada, 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 yada. And now what we're going to do is we are going to the API part. There we go, API. I'm going to create a new project quickly. JSWORLD. Save it. Use the HTTP client. Now, import. And as I said, now we are at the part where we are going to import that created HAR file from a real device job. Could be also virtual, could be a browser test, it doesn't matter. This is the one I just did. Yeah. Import. We are going to put it here in the root folder of this project. There we go. And here we go. Here are all the requests the app did. So, for example, this one. This. So, and when we run this API call, you get back a response. Now, let's take a look at it for a second. So, it's a JSON array basically. We have, some fields with some values. Could be anything. And now, if you had to write a test for every single field you see here in this response, it would be either be a lot of writing, or you find a tool to do it for you. What we do here is we can generate a test based out of the response. So we call it my first test, create test. There we go. Now, when you looked at every single field in the response, we have taken that and automatically created assertions against every single one of them, depending on the type. So we have, for example, this one here who is asserting that the content type is equal to application JSON. We are making sure that the payload is an array. We are making sure that CPU cores is an integer, that the frequency is an integer, the default orientation that this field exists, and so on and so forth. This is our first test. Let's run it, just make sure it's, working. And while it is running, what we can do here, because this is a single API call, this is not how APIs work. Usually you have multiple calls chained together, and then you build basically an end-to-end flow, which you can do here as well by adding additional API commands. We're not going to do that. We're just going to publish what we have, and that's it. We have now a functional API test that is not just checking that the endpoint is returning something useful, like 200. We are also making sure that the response back is actually correct. The type is correct. Now, wouldn't it be great, in this case it's a production API anyway, so it would be great if we had some monitoring based on our functional test we just created. So that's what we are going to do. Going to create a schedule. The first test, the only test, my first test, is here already pre-selected. I have to give my scheduler a name, so my scheduler. We are going to run this every 5 minutes, every day, basically, from now on. Click on Save. There we go. Now, what we're doing here is that test, that one test we created, and it could be a lot more, it could be hundreds, thousands of tasks, are now run every 5 minutes. Should something happen on your production API, you will get, it will fail, the test will fail, you will immediately see what failed, and you will get a notification about it. Now, going back here, this is what you saw. This is the har file we capture with all the responses, requests, and so on. And going back here, we have time, so let's do that. Let's do this. Let me give you an additional goodie here. This is a Docker container I'm going to spin up here on my computer. It's probably someone who is doing demo training somewhere is probably telling me now, or doing this, like, how can the guy change his script? But anyway. Now, we have a functional test. We are using it for monitoring. Wouldn't it be great if we also could use the same thing we already created once, like a function, and reuse it for more? And yes, we're going to do that. We're going to create a load test. So we are load testing a production API in Source Labs live. And I'm hoping that the product manager is not going to call me. Anyway, so just doing a 1-minute load test. We're going to use this agent, which is created here for my Docker. Let me just make it bigger. Yep, there we go. With, let's play 5. Save and run. Now we have that one API, right? That endpoint, the test, and we're now reusing the same thing to run a load test on this endpoint. Load test. Ah, yeah, there we go. There we go. My computer in this VLAN, Wi-Fi, sorry, is now doing all the calls with 5 virtual users, calling this API over and over again, and every time verifying, hey, the response is correct. It has the correct content type. It has the correct, field name, field data type, and so on and so forth. And we will get the result here if I refresh the page. OK, 1 minute is not over yet. We'll come back to that in 30 seconds or so. So what you heard now earlier is basically we created a functional test using captured har file, using a har file which captures API requests and responses. We are asserting that the response is correct in that API call we do. And we use that functional test to do API monitoring. We're monitoring our APIs with a functional test, which could be an end-to-end test as well, if you expand it. As I said, we are skipping that part, and I'm going back here to show you that it worked. There were no failures. We had a couple of requests we did. 36. All of them were passing. It's a 200. And basically, what I want to say is thanks for your attention. If you want to look at some of the stuff, I don't know if the slides are shared or so, but I got some URLs here for you to check out. Having said that, thanks a lot. And I want to give you back 5 minutes and 30 seconds for your lunchtime. Thank you.